Without further ado, as somebody said last night, so aptly put it, this is the first time out of 99 fests that we actually have a person that can say honestly that he was, in fact, a Beatle at the Fest for Beatles Fans. Please welcome Pete Best. Pete Best, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Pete. Woo. It is a thrill to have you here.
Oh, it's great being here. Yeah.
Speaking on behalf of everybody here, all the fans that have seen photos of you over the years and have heard stories about you over the years and to finally actually get to hear your side of everything, it's a thrill. But it would be fun tonight, especially assuming a lot of you weren't here yesterday, so feel free to repeat anything that was said yesterday.
Okay.
That let's start at the very beginning. We talked about your mother a bit last night. That'd be an interesting place to start. What role your mother had in this whole Liverpool scene, and then how you fit into it.
Okay. Well, that takes us back to 1959, when my mother decided to open a coffee club called the Casbah in the basement of our house in Liverpool. And I know there's a few faces which you've seen out there which have already been to the Casbah, right? Is that right? Yeah, okay. So, you know what I'm talking about. But the funny thing was, we set a date for it, which was the 29th of August 1959, which was going to be the opening date. And the band which should have opened it, which was the Les Stewart Quartet, broke up a couple of weeks beforehand, which left my mother in a little bit of a bloody predicament, right? So, two of the members of the band, one happened to be George Harrison, and the other guy was Ken Brown, who's still a very dear friend of mine. And they came down and saw my mother and said, Mona, because she didn't like to be called Mrs. Best. That was too formal. To friends, it was Mona or Mo. And they turned around and said, we got bad news for you. So she said, what's that, my boys? And he said, the Les Stewart Quartet is defunct. So she said, well, what are we going to do? So George basically turned around and said, I happen to know a couple of guys who I used to play with, and they're not doing anything at the present moment, and I'm going to offer them the job. So if they're interested, I'll bring them down tomorrow. So my mother turned around and said, George, go with my blessings, see if you sort this problem out for me. So lo and behold, the next day, two lads turned up with George, right? They happened to be John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Whoa. Sir Paul McCartney.
Do you have to kiss his ring?
Not quite, no. But I don't think I'd appreciate it, and I'm certain he wouldn't. But anyway, my mother put the deal to them, and it was going to be a residency in those days. And residencies in those days were like gold. So she turned around and said, that's the deal. You're going to play every Saturday night. And what are you going to call yourselves? So John stepped up and he basically turned around and said, well, we used to be called the Quarrymen. So how does that sound? So my mother turned around and said, sounds great to me. So they dashed into the club and they had a look round, decided where they were going to play, and they picked out what we call the middle chamber, right? And you've seen photographs of that particular opening night, so you'll know how small it was. And there was no drummer. There was just John, George, Paul and Ken Brown. And a couple of weeks to go to opening night, and they wanted to get involved, so being happy-handed lads, they rolled the sleeves up and got the paint cans out, and John painted the Aztec ceiling, Paul painted the rainbow ceiling, John, George, Paul, myself, Ken Brown, every other Tom, Dick and Harry who could get in there, painted the stars in the Casbah. And for those of you who've been there, you'll know that those artifacts are still there today, okay? And it's great to actually see them, and it's total originality. So if you ever come to the Casbah, you'll be able to see this for yourself, okay? John's paintings, Paul's paintings, the stars on the ceiling, where they actually played, and also where John decided he was going to engrave, with a penknife, his initials on a plank of wood. And they're still there. Okay. Now that bit didn't, how could I turn around and put it, enthrall my mother too much. In fact, she gave him a bloody good ticking off, right? But that's another story. Anyway, opening night came, and it was a great opening night, as we basically turned around and discussed it last night. It was very good. I was in the audience, the atmosphere, the music they were playing. And it was the success of that particular night, I could see my mother in the corner, and she was already thinking, okay, Saturday night, I want live music to be in the club every night of the week. So she started to expand. The next band which came in was Derry and the Seniors. The next band which came in after that was Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And there was a young drummer in it, whose name I forget, but I think it ended with Star. I'm joking. And it went on from that. And we had, live music in the club 7 nights a week, long before the Cavern ever became, the club which everyone knows today. Now, as a result of that, okay, she realised that all the top bands in Liverpool were going to play there. You had your Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Big Three, Billy J. Kramer, Farron and the Flamingos, the Beatles, even though they weren't the Beatles then. Onwards and onwards. Every name band in Liverpool played there. But she also decided that she wanted young bands to play there. She wanted to give bands a chance. So her thought and philosophy was basically, come down, we'll audition you, we'll let you play. If you crack it, you play the Casbah. If you don't, go away, practice, and when you're good enough, we'll give you another shot. And that was their philosophy. And it worked because, what she did over the period of time that the Casbah was open, it became the catalyst for the Merseybeat sound. As I keep repeating, every major band played there. But she was an unsung hero. She was the first female promoter in Liverpool to, open up a humble, I suppose you could turn around and say, coffee club. We called it a coffee club because there was membership. There wasn't a normal coffee bar. And, she turned it into this prolific, I suppose you could turn around and say, rock seller, right? And it was great because I used to run home from school and all these bands were playing downstairs. Right? Homework? No, never thought about it. But it was great because she was an unsung hero. She threw out many, many things to the Beatles. She helped them. She stayed in the wings. Her contribution. A lot of it we've covered. I mean, if a lot of you, I know which you have because you've been a wonderful audience and you bought a lot of books, The Beatles, The True Beginnings, which myself and my other two brothers wrote. And their story is actually explained in detail in that. And I think people, which is very courteous of you, have recognised the input that she did have. And they've come up and turned around and said, your mother was one hell of a woman. And I can endorse that totally. She was the love of my life. I still idolise her. And she was a woman of great prophecy, great foresight. And she deserves all the credit that I can give her.
All right. Pete, how big was the Casbah? How many people could you fit in there without exploding?
Well, before health and safety regulations got into force, okay. I suppose you could turn around and say comfortably about 250. Okay. But we have had 1,000 in there. Now you're going to turn around and say, how the hell can you get 1,000 people into the Casbah? With great difficulty. But what you've got to realise, for those of you who've been to the Casbah, you realise that it stands in an old Victorian house from the cellars, and it stands in its own ground. It's got a massive garden, it's got a courtyard, and it's got paths. Okay, and the funny thing was on that particular opening night, and when the Beatles played there, okay, the queue used to stretch from where the entrance to the club was right the way down Hayman's Green. Okay, the club opened at 7:30. Always used to kick it off with Johnny and the Hurricanes' Red River Rock. So anyone who was waiting outside, the minute they heard that music blasting out from the club, they knew the doors were going to open. So we had many, many nights when the Beatles were playing, when we tried to get, well, we didn't try, we got them, 1,000 people in, right? They were stuck in the toilets, on the staircase, in the garden, hanging off the ceilings. The walls were going like that, right? And it was sardine time. But the kids loved it, and it was wonderful to play down there because it had such an atmosphere. And when you've got 1,000 people packed in there, whoa, that's a hell of a place to play. Okay.
If people go to Liverpool now, can they visit the Casbah?
They can. I'm glad to say that after many, many years of wrangling with the council, red tape and all the other bits and pieces, we've got it back on the tourist trail again. And this year, thank you. And this year we've started to accept bookings by appointment only, so that we can, give you the personal touch and take you around the Casbah and tell our wonderful stories and explain where the lads stand and, you know, who stood there, and, you know, I've seen people come to the Casbah, right, and you're walking around and you're explaining to them, because those of you who've been there, we've had a couple of parties there, haven't we? Yeah. I'm glad you remember them, because I can't. But anyway, it's wonderful to actually see and explain, you know, the atmosphere to them, and the, you know, touching the cladding on the wall, and you turn around and say, John Lennon stood there, and they're like, oh, God. It's the hallowed ground, you know. And then Paul stood here, and, you know, George went for a piss over there, and it's like, whoa, you know, this is great, you know. So they're sitting in the toilets going, oh, I know who sat here, you know, this is it. But, you know, it's a great place to be, and we have wonderful times there, and we're glad to say that, you know, this year we've started to accept bookings by appointment only. So if you're in Liverpool, and the winners, if you ever get to Liverpool, you know, with Icelandair, we'd like to see you. You know, pick up the phone. Tourist board knows where we are, and we'd be too glad to show you around and give you the personal touch. Okay.
Great. Now, I don't think we can imagine opening up a club in our basement, in our homes, without the neighbors freaking out. Did you have trouble with the neighbors and the police and all that?
Initially, not so much with the police, because it was great, you know, when we opened. And the funny thing was, before we opened, we had a membership of 250. You know, kids coming up to the door and not going to believe there's going to be a club. Yeah, it's going to open in about 3 months' time, but I want to be a member. Okay, you know. Membership in those days was a hell of a lot, right? 5 shillings a year. Now you're looking at me going, what the hell is 5 shillings? I can't even remember now. Right, but I think it's about 25 cents. But in those days, it was a lot of money. Okay, believe you me. But anyway, police, the Casbah for the police, it was a haven, right? Because all the kids were in one place. They knew where they were, you know, and it was like, yeah, Mona's got them off the street, they're in the Casbah, you know, if we want to find them, we'll go down there. So, and it was like, you know, typical of the policemen, you know, the old English bobbies, you know, they knew the club was open and they knew it was a coffee club, and it would be like, hats off as they came through the door. We've just come in to see everything's okay, Mrs. Best. Yes, would you like a cup of coffee, lads? Oh, okay then, yes, you know. The neighbours, now that was a different question, because we had a few frumps, you know. I have to say that politely. I'd have called them something else, but I'll call them frumps for the present moment, okay? And my mother, being a woman of great ingenuity, she turned around, and when a few of them started complaining about kids in the path, because it was, you know, we were in a rural area, we weren't town centre, you know, we were out in West Derby Village, about 5 miles from Liverpool, and they came, and it was like, oh, Mrs. Best, we can't put up with this, all these kids, you know, frivolous kids roaming around and all the other bits and pieces. And she went, come down one night. Come in and see what the kids are doing. And of course they came, and after that, all the neighbours in Hayman's Greens remembered the Casbah. Right? They were there every night of the week. So she had a good brain.
Now, a lot of people have given their theories as to why Liverpool, with all this explosion of talent and music and energy. What's your theory? Because you were right in the middle of it. Why do you think it was Liverpool and not some other town in England that gave birth to all this?
I think Liverpool has always had a very strong musical heritage. Okay, long before the world, you know, got to know about the Merseybeat, and it was always there. I mean, it's gone back. You know, there was blues bands there, jazz bands, big bands, you know, skiffle groups, you name it. It was only when, I suppose you could turn around and say, the Beatles got signed up by EMI and they started to chart, that the record industry in London suddenly realised, you know, there was music outside of the London area. And of course, when that happened, the floodgates opened for Liverpool. And there'd been this vibrant music scene which had been there for many, many, many years. And people suddenly discovered it, okay? And once it was discovered and the record companies knew, you know, that this wonderful sound, this Merseybeat, this, you know, savage powerhouse sound coming out of Liverpool, they signed up every band in Liverpool. And of course, you know, we invaded America basically. And, you know, that's how Liverpool got on the map. And it also had something to do with a band called Beatles as well. I think
yeah, that helped. Now, when Mona helped you pack your suitcase, the time you headed off for Germany, Hamburg, Germany, the first time, did she have any idea her little boy was going to go off and play in one of the seediest areas in the world?
I think she did, because she turned around and said, when we said ta-da, she just basically turned around and said, son, have a good time, but be careful. And, I think we realised, I don't think, to be quite honest, that, jesting apart, I don't think anyone realised. We realised that, okay, we were going to be away from home. We were in a strange country. We were young lads, when you think about it. We were 17, 18-year-olds with, healthy appetites. And, of course, hungry, big eaters. So when we got there, it was like pearls before swine, as I turned around and said, those of you who've been to Hamburg, and a few people mentioned the Herbertstrasse. Yes, I know. And, he turned around and said, I couldn't take photographs in the Herbertstrasse. So I said, well, if you've got one, show me it, because I'd love to have a look at it again. But anyway, for those of you who don't know, the Herbertstrasse was a little side street off the Reeperbahn where prostitutes and ladies of ill repute used to sit in the windows. Yes.
It's like grocery shopping, right?
And every morning, the Beatles would go for breakfast via the Herbertstrasse to the Siemens Mission, and we come back again via the Herbertstrasse, right? And we knew every girl in the window. Right? And that takes some doing, believe you me. Right? But anyway, it was, we were there, as I mentioned before, it was pearls before swine. We didn't realise that it was, the sin city of the world at the present moment, the red light district, biggest entertainment quarter. But once we familiarised ourselves with it, we enjoyed ourselves totally, right? Hence condoms, right? Hence condoms.
There is that infamous condom story about you and Paul that got you in a bit of trouble.
Yes, there was actually, yeah. We'd defected to the Top 10 Club. And we went back, we were staying in the Black Holes of Calcutta, which is what we called our, dungeons that we were staying in at the back of the Bambino. And it was very much a case of, we went there, we played the Top 10, and we had to go and get our luggage, right? What was left of it anyway. Everything had rotted, and by this time we were living in our leather pants and leather jackets and, anything else that was leather. And we basically... Did someone say underpants over? That came afterwards. But anyway, we had to go and get our luggage, and as I mentioned before, there was no light at the back of the Bambino, right? So, being good, clean living lads in this wonderful town of Hamburg, we had a couple of condoms on us, right? And we stuck them on the wall, lit them, and they spluttered, right? And as the lads, and maybe some of the lasses will know, if you light condoms, they splutter, and they give up a terrible stink, right? But it gave us enough light to basically throw our belongings together, and we buggered off back to the Top 10 Club. Now, the next morning, we were dragged out, woken up by two, I suppose you could turn around and say, two German guerrillas, policemen, 8'10" high, 6 foot broad, noses like that. And, Paul and I are lying in bed, just got into bed, and knock on the door. Herr Best and Herr McCartney. And there we are, standing there in our underpants. Yeah, okay, yeah, who was it? And we're whisked off to Davidstrasse police station, right? And then we got told while we were there, after being grilled for many, many hours, that Bruno Koschmieder had charged us with trying to burn the Bambino down. As he turned around and said, charged us with arson. And we always turned around and said, arson for arson about. But that's a different story anyway. But as a result of that, we got deported, we got thrown in jail. Okay, we thought we were never going to see the light of day again, right? From the police station, yanked off to Hamburg jail with all the convicts and thieves and criminals and locked up in a little billet. We thought, my God, here we are going to spend the rest of our days. Then we were deported. We were thrown out the country courtesy of the German government. But I'm glad to say We disputed it, told our story to the German embassy. They thought it was absolutely hilarious, you know. Mind you, we did change it a little bit. Right? We didn't turn around and say we stuck condoms on the wall. We'd have never got back in again. We turned around and said there was a little bit of tapestry hanging off which we lost. And they believed us. And we got back in again. Otherwise, there may never been another trip to Hamburg. And there may never have been another Beatles. But it was a great thing. But as Paul and I, you know, for many, many months afterwards when we got back into Hamburg, we used to laugh and joke about it because we always turned around and said, you know, we were charged with burning the Bambino down. And as we always turned around and said, how the hell can you burn a bloody concrete cinema down with a couple of condoms? Right? It does not work, right? But please, don't experiment. Just because I've turned around and said, you know, I can see some of the lads going back home and saying, you know, I'm going to stick these bloody condoms on the door and see what the Pete says is true, you know. I got kicked out of Germany. I don't want to get kicked out of America. So, behave yourselves, okay?
Well, it wasn't the last time Paul went to jail either. So.
No, I believe there was another little incident afterwards. Yeah.
I don't know about you, but you don't have to go there. So, now George had already been deported.
Yeah.
What happened to John during all this time?
John, he was there. As he turned around and said, it was. He didn't even know we'd been deported, to be quite honest. He was expecting us to come back from the police station and just resume playing. So after a couple of days, it was like, you know, where the bloody hell have Paul and Pete gone? He's on stage with Tony Sheridan and Steve Sutcliffe, right? No Paul, no Pete, no George. Right? So the penny suddenly dropped, you know, and someone basically turned around and said, oh, those two buggers are being deported back to Liverpool. So we stayed there for a couple of weeks, and he was very despondent because George had gone home, as Terry said, you know, because he was sent home because after all this time we'd been in Germany 4 months, he was suddenly found out to be too young to perform, right? And he was sent home. Right? Stu decided that he was going to stay in Germany because he'd fallen in love with Astrid Kirchner. And everyone knows Astrid Kirchner. She's this beautiful German girl, wonderful photographer, and Stu fell in love with her. So he was going to stay. That left John on his little Jack Jones. Right? So after a couple of weeks, he decided, I've had enough of this. And he came back to Liverpool. Right? Now, everyone thought that he was going to be very angry with us for leaving him in the lurch. Right? So when he came back, he was despondent. And I was like, you know, why didn't you guys turn around and tell me that you left Hamburg? They said, well, we didn't have a chance, John. You know, we got yanked out the police station, stuck in jail, and then stuck on a plane, flown back to London, and we had to make our own way home. And he turned around and said, well, you know, it left me out there all by myself. So for many, many weeks afterwards, we used to take the mickey out of John, right? And basically turn around and say, you know, you were left in Germany. But we came to a truce, okay. And, you know, once we explained the situation, he saw the humorous side of it. And we started playing in Liverpool.
Did you think then that could have been the end of the group?
Did I?
Did you think that might have been the end of the group then because it was kind of falling apart? Or
I think we all did, because it looked at one stage as though we'd been dissected. And because Stu was staying over there, John was still over there, George had come home a couple of weeks beforehand. Paul and I, we didn't know whether in fact we were going to be able to go back to Germany. And it meant that we didn't have a band in Liverpool. You know, the members weren't there. And then we finally, you know, for a long, long time, we were in Liverpool. We should have been playing straight away, and it took most probably about 2 or 3 weeks to actually get to grips with the situation again. It was only when John came back home again, we suddenly realised that we had a band. And that was when a friend of mine called Chaz Newby stood in on bass because Stu was still in Germany. And he covered about 4 gigs with the Beatles. So his claim to fame is that he was the 7th Beatle. And he's a great lad. He did 4 gigs with us. But as a result of that, then we realised that Stu was coming back to Liverpool again. And once the 5 of us were together again, then we started performing in Liverpool, and we took Liverpool by storm.
Unfortunately, we only have a couple raw bootlegs and photographs, no film of your sets in Hamburg. And we've heard stories about how electric they were and exciting and raw. And Tony Sheridan and Roy Young and people like that would sit in with you and play. What was it like drumming in that time? What was going on stage? What was the feel?
Well, it's not like it is today, where you were mic'd up or anything, They went through a mixing board and, had synthesizers and drum machines. Horrible word, that, drum machines. And, it was basically a case of, we had to crank the sound out. And even when we were playing with Tony and, with Roy Young, who was, a great piano player, being a drummer, I realised that I was the engine room of the band. And I had to basically, with not being amped up or mic'd up, I had to start playing a drum pattern and developing a type of beat which would hold everything, solid. And I developed a style. Didn't think I was doing anything different from anyone else, but I was playing a lot of tom-tom, a lot of bass drum work, and, a lot of work off the snare drums, doubling up with what you were normally doing on the cymbals. Now that worked to basically, project and give the energy to the band. They could lock into what I was doing. And that was the sound which we developed in Germany. And of course, when we brought it back to Liverpool, someone was watching me play. And I think it was Bill Harry, who was the editor of Mersey Beat. He nicknamed it the Atom Beat, right? And as a result of that, every drummer in Liverpool, including Mr. Starr, decided that they were going to copy my style. And there was a lot of bands in Liverpool which changed drummers, unfortunately, to try and copy the style that I was playing.
But it must have been an exciting experience, though, those Hamburg nights, because John later said that was some of the best music they ever made was in those clubs, just because it was so raw and energetic and good.
It was, I think, without being biased, and, it might sound biased coming from me, but it was very much a case of, as John basically turned around and said, and people who've actually seen us over there have basically turned around and said that, the Beatles were at their best playing in and around the clubs of Hamburg. And it was very true. I think, for the people who actually never saw the Beatles in Hamburg or in Liverpool, as lots of bands in Liverpool turn around and say they never actually saw the Beatles,
We could take questions, too, if anybody would like to come up here. But we've had, like, Astrid and, all come in here and speak, and Klaus. And they've told stories about the first time they walked into the club and saw you and those guys play and how it changed their lives. It was so dramatic. They were stunned. They were so excited by what was that magic? What was that all about?
Well, I think it was because, live bands weren't, at that time in Germany, there weren't too many of them. Derry and the Seniors were there. They were the first band from Liverpool. And we followed out. The fact, our presence and the way that we were acting on stage, our banter, the sound that we were playing as well, it was excitement to them. They'd never seen anything like it. We were lads from Liverpool. They couldn't get over the way that we were acting on stage and the type of music that we were playing. Now, the funny thing is, Terry, that at the same time, we were totally impressed with them because we were looking at the way they were dressed. Astrid was in her leathers and her suedes, and her boots and, the hairstyle. So there was an amalgamation of bodies, and it was like, we were looking at them turning around and saying, it's going to be great to try and get mixed up with them. And of course we did once Stu fell in love with Astrid. But also at the same time, they were enamored with us because they wanted to, be our friends, so to speak. And it just developed from there.
Hello.
Oh, yeah.
As a long-time Beatles Fest veteran, I want to say that I think this is the finest fest ever because you're here. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question is twofold. The first part is, it's my understanding that there were 3 versions of Love Me Do that had Ringo drumming, you drumming, and session drummer Andy White drumming, that the Andy White version is what was released over here. The Ringo version was released in Canada and other places. Was the version that you were on ever released in before the anthology back, in the mid-'90s? And then the second part of the question is, I'd read an interview that you did with Goldmine back in about 1982, and in that interview you said that you had not spoken to any of the other Beatles since having departed the group, and I wondered if since then, if you had.
Okay, I'll take the first one, which was the Love Me Do. No, to be quite honest, the version of Love Me Do, which I did, which ended up on the anthology, was only, I suppose you could turn around and say, a demonstration. You know, it was a sample. We'd gone down, that particular version, we laid down, it was just to give George Martin an idea of what our sounds were like, you know, and the type of material that we wanted to play. Of course, as you so rightly turned around and said, Andy White was brought in, you know. I think Ringo played maracas or tambourine on that particular version. And Ringo did a version. You know, Andy's was released first, then Ringo's was released. And the version that I did, which was only really a demo, apparently according to EMI archives, got lost, right? But miraculously came to life again, right, for the anthology. So, you know, so there we go with that one. And the second question, okay, have I ever spoken to any of them? At the present moment, it's, if you'd have asked me 15 years ago, the most probably turned around and said no. Because, as I've said in the interviews and many, many times, you know, never actually spoke to them, played on the same bill as them 3 times. There was no communication. And, you know, we went on. And a lot of people have always turned around and said, it would have been so easy to pick up the phone, you know. And it's not. You know, that doesn't happen. The Beatles by this time were becoming this actual, you know, the icons of the music industry. The NEMS empire was growing. And it didn't matter who you were, right? If the Beatles didn't want to talk to you, or Brian Epstein didn't want to talk to you, and if your name was Pete Best, they didn't want to talk to you. No, just an aside, you couldn't get through to them. So consequently, as a result of that, you know, and you persevere, you're still in show business, so you know, continuing with your own career. Now, as I mentioned before, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, before I came into this crazy business again, right, I'd have turned around and said no. But because of the anthology, because of certain things which are going on behind the scenes at the present moment, and that's all I'm going to say, right, there's a strong warning that possibly sometime in the future, and don't ask me when, because I can't turn around and tell you that either. All I will turn around and say is that we may meet up again, and it might be on a playing level, it might be on a social level, it might be just on a friendship level. Even though I've never fell out of friends with them, but it's just to, you know, sort of, you know, meet up with one another again and say hi before we leave this planet and pass on to different pastures. Now, if that happens, you know, I'm looking forward to it. Okay.
Did you ever see that picture of the Beatles in the studio and George is sporting a black eye that he got from one of your fans who was a little bit perturbed at the way you were dealt with?
Oh, I've seen that, yeah, you know. No, I had nothing to do with it. No, you know. Believe you me. But I do happen to know the guy who planted it. Right? No, that was something which apparently happened. They'd been playing down at the Cavern. And they'd been doing some filming, I think it was for Granada TV, which was one of the first shows which came out. And as they were coming out, because there was such a lot of fan reaction in Liverpool, you know, they were threatened, there was a lot of hostility, Brian needed bodyguards to walk him down the street. And there was reaction from the fans. And this particular day when George walked out, some young guy nutted him, right? And he had a black eye. And as Terry so rightly turns around and says, there's lots of photographs where you see George in studio, and he's just got the remnants of a black eye down there. But I didn't have anything to do with it.
Evening, best. Thank you so very much for being here tonight. And thank you so very much for your book. I must say it was one of the best Christmas gifts I received last year. And I spent 2 days in bed reading it and draw it once. I couldn't let it go my hands once. But, you know, I'm not as wise as many of the Beatles fans in this room. This is only my 3rd Beatles Fest here. And I'm amazed at the wisdom in this room here. But, sir, why Ringo Starr and why not you? Do you know the reason why? Do you know the reason why? In the book, you don't seem to answer that, do you know?
I wish I knew. You're asking me the $1,000,000 question, right? It was done something which was, as we explained, and I've explained many, many times, it was done without any forewarning. You know, I was basically a Beatle one night. I played the cabin. And the next night I was called into Brian Epstein's office, and, you know, within 10 minutes of going into the office, I was no longer a Beatle, and Ringo had been, you know, drawn in, and, you know, he was joining the band on Saturday. As to regards why Ringo, I don't know. All that I do know is that after it happened, there were a few drummers in Liverpool who basically came up and turned around and said, Pete, we were offered that job, okay, but we turned it down because we didn't want to take your job. It was your gig. You'd been with the band for 2 years. You know, you deserve the limelight for it. You know, you've put in a lot of hard work for the band. So I don't know whether it was a case of, you know, because they would turn the gig down, you know, Ringo was the last guy on the block. And, you know, they went and they put the deal to him. And, of course, you know, you've got to, you know, jesting aside, at the end of the day, you've got to be realistic about it. You know, if someone comes along, Ringo was with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes had been eclipsed by the Beatles, okay. They were one of the major bands in Liverpool at one time. And they were still getting gigs, but, you know, they weren't of the same level as the Beatles. You know, they dropped from superiority. They become, you know, one of the local bands in Liverpool. Now, all of a sudden, you get someone, from what I believe, knocking on the door while they're at Butlin's holiday camp, right, and turning around and saying, and it's common knowledge that by this time the Beatles have got the recording contract and the prowess of the Beatles. So if someone knocks on your door and basically turns around and says, do you want to join us? And he's with a 50-50 band, right? You've got to think about it, you know. He'd be out of his mind if he didn't accept a job with the best band in Liverpool. So, you know, being fair to him, you know, he accepted it, and good luck to him as well. Okay, that's all I can turn around and say.
Thank you again for coming. It's a thrill to meet you. Your insights on John Lennon, when you knew him back in those days, and as you watched his career evolve through the Beatles and as a solo artist, did you see anything in him back then that emerged in the 70s? And just in general, your opinion of his legacy with the perspective of having known him when he was 15? Thank you.
Great question. Okay. First of all, I'd just like to turn around and say, you know, that out of all the Beatles, even though I was friends with all of them, I was closest to John, right? John and I had an affinity which was, I suppose, grew up in Hamburg. If you go back to that early stage, you can go back before that as well. I mean, the first time I saw John, I was very impressed with him because he came down to, you know, when they were offered the job for the Casbah as the quarryman. And I liked his sense of humour, and I liked the, you know, the cut of the lad, you know, with his sideburns and his swept-back hairstyle, and, you know, the banter that he had. And then, of course, I'd watched him from a distance, and then, of course, when I actually joined the band, I got to know, with being in Hamburg, away from home, that there was another side to John, which the world never saw. They did afterwards, okay? But at that particular moment in time, John was very much, there was a defense mechanism with John, which was very much, you know, he had a cynical sense of humour. He wouldn't let people get too close to him. And I think that was because of the tragedy he'd suffered with his mother. And being in Hamburg and, you know, propping the bars up, that's where I got the affinity with John. We spent many, many nights together leaning on the bars, okay? And I suddenly realised, you know, that there was another side of John, which was a very loving, a very tender side. Okay, and you take those two entities and you put it together. That was the complete man, right? Then, unfortunately, my demise from the Beatles, you know, so I can only remember John and personally reflect to him with, you know, the thoughts that I had. But watching his career as it grew, you know, there was something there, there was always something there which was latent, and I think that was the force which the world knew John for, you know, as regards his ideas, his philosophies, you know, his ideas about peace and all the other bits and pieces. And I think it was there, it was inherent in him, and the world saw that afterwards.
Did you get to talk to him in the 70s at all?
Unfortunately, you know, I wish I had. Okay. Okay.
Did you know Julia or Aunt Mimi?
Yes, I know Julia. I was in Australia with her a couple of weeks ago. Well, a couple of months ago now.
No, I mean Julia, his mother.
No, sorry.
Okay.
I was talking about John's half-sister.
His sister, yeah, right.
No, I never actually met her. Because unfortunately, just before the advent of the Casbah, that's when all of this trouble happened. You know.
Now, how about Aunt Mimi? Did you ever
Oh, Aunt Mimi, yeah, I saw Aunt Mimi, yeah, because John used to spend a lot of time at my house, and I used to spend a lot of time at John's house, but it was Aunt Mimi's house. And I always remember John basically turning around and saying, because you had two different people. You had Mona at Hayman's Green, which was my own mother, who was very outgoing and, young at heart and, into music and like, young children and all the other bits and pieces. And of course, John used to, when he used to go to his place, he'd turn around and say, Pete, Aunt Mimi's going to be in, right? So I am going to change into my grey pants, not my jeans, and become a normal guy. She was pretty straight-laced, but I found that she was a very tender and a very loving woman as well.
What door did she make you enter in? Did you get to go in the front door, or did you have to go around to the back?
Oh, we had to go around the back. Yeah. Yeah. Tradesman entrance for you two. Yeah, that was it.
And how is Julia, his sister?
Julia's good. She's, doing an awful lot of peace work with people, underprivileged kids. And she's a great talker. And she's, we spent many, many hours chatting together when we were in Australia. And, we had some laughs and we had some tears as well.
She's done some remarkable interviews. Her insights on John are very unique.
Very much, yeah.
Hey, Pete.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. Just wanted to say, rather than a question, that, there's obviously Beatles fans are here, but a lot of musicians are here as well. And I don't, there's certainly not a single musician here. I'm a musician as well. That didn't. All of us started playing music because of the Beatles, and that means because of you as well. So thank you very much for your the jettison of the Beatles. But as any of these musicians will tell you, it's very difficult when it dawns on you that the band you started playing music because of the Beatles. Eventually, it dawns on you, I'm not going to be in the Beatles. I mean, it's not going to happen for us, and it never will. For any band, even if you're one of the biggest bands in the world right now, there will only be one band like that, and it's kind of a life lesson, and it's hard, for musicians for so many reasons. And you made it through the 60s and all the turbulent changes that took place in the 60s and the 70s, and you're here. And one thing that I want to thank you for is your healthy attitude, that I just want to say, God bless you for being here and for your very healthy attitude. You made it, brother.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I've got a friend from Richmond, and he told me to ask you, are you red or blue?
I'm blue. I'm blue.
Thanks a lot, Pete.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And he's a darn good musician, this lad here.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for coming to the BeatleCon. After all these years being like a Beatle fan, it's kind of cool to see it. My question was, when the Beatles changed their hair, what were you thinking at that time?
When the Beatles...
When they changed their hair to the,
The mop top.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, I think, just to get this into perspective, I think a lot of people thought that, the Beatle hairstyle developed overnight. It didn't. The first one to actually wear it down was Stu Sutcliffe, right? And that was because Astrid had become his girlfriend, and, she was, I suppose, creating him, changing him, his hairstyle into, part of her friends. And he wore his hair down. And, we still had our hair up at that time, Tony Curtis's, DA's in the back, Elvis Presley, whatever name you call it. And, the first time he came with his hair down like this, it was like, ah! What's that? And so I was like, what the hell are you laughing at? So then we shamefaced into him. It was like, okay. He combed it back up into his Jimmy Dean style. And then he tried it again, and eventually, we let him get on with it. And then lo and behold, the next to do was George, right? But he came, and George's hair, if you see the early photographs, he had a bit of a quiff, a little bit spiky, and all of a sudden George's hair was starting to come down, and it was like, what are you doing? I'm combing my hair down. So it was like, okay, fair enough. Still left 3 of us, right? The next thing was that we'd back, and this would be around about 61, and who was left? Yeah, John and Paul, they went off to Paris on a holiday for about a week. We had a break in some sessions, so they went off to Paris. And they met one of Astrid's friends over there, a guy called Jürgen Vollmer, right? And lo and behold, they came back with mop tops. So that leaves me, doesn't it? Right? And as I've always said before, no one asked me. I didn't think it was going to be, a hairstyle, it was something which transpired. So I just kept wearing my hair up, just flicked it up. I liked it in that style. And then, of course, when, the Beatles cracked the barrier, and the phenomena had started, basically. And people were identifying the fact that, okay, everyone was wearing their hair down in this, the mop tops. People suddenly started turning around and saying, oh, that was the reason you got kicked out the band, And it wasn't, okay. Now, just to prove a point, when I came to America for about 6 months in around about mid-60s, okay, with my own band, and we'd toured and recorded over here, just to prove a point, right, I combed my hair down, right, and I wore it down for about 6 months, and then I said, I've had enough of this, right, and I've combed it back ever since. Well, what's left of it anyway, so... But it was great. I mean, it was nice to see the style, it was part of the styling that, they went through.
Do you want to tell everybody what DA stands for?
DA stands for duck's arse. Have you ever seen the backside of a duck? No? Yes? Yeah. It goes like that, doesn't it? The tail feathers go like that, right? So, duck's arse, right? Okay.
Thanks, Pete, for being here, and I think in many Beatle fans' heart, including mine, once a Beatle, always a Beatle. I don't know if you covered this already. I know John Lennon said the best work that the Beatles did was left unrecorded in Hamburg. And okay. And any reflections on Stuart Sutcliffe?
Yeah, I agree with John. Some of the best work we did was done in Hamburg. Never got onto record, even though some of the material that got onto record, My Bonnie and Cry for a Shadow and Ain't She Sweet, I still tap my feet to them every time I hear them, and it brings back good memories. But I still say that the live music, no one could copy the sound that the Beatles had, and you had to actually hear the band live to actually copy that particular sound. Now, Stu Sutcliffe was a great guy, right? A lot of time for Stu Sutcliffe. He was the smallest guy in the band in stature, right? And regardless of what people turn around and say, and I've said this many, many times, and I said it last night, and I'll say it tomorrow, and the day after, and every time someone talks to me about Stu Sutcliffe. Stu was always portrayed as being a bad bass player, right? And he wasn't, okay? There are better bass players, and there are worse bass players. But what that lad gave to the band as regards contribution was phenomenal. He gave 200%. And if someone gives you 200% when you're playing live music, and they're playing their heart and soul, then they can't be doing a bad job. Okay? And the other side of Stu was the fact that the world knows now. Sadly, he's no longer here. But Stu was a brilliant artist. And if you ever get a chance to actually see any of his work, you will realise the stature of the man. Okay? He was small in stature, but he was a giant in the artistic world. Okay?
All right. We just have a couple more minutes, but we haven't hit on yet your relationship with Paul and George. What do you remember of those two? Especially George now that he's gone.
Take George first, youngest member in the band. And in fact, to be quite honest, I was called the quiet one, but I think George was quieter than me, right? He was very shy. I won't say timid, but there was a very shy, sensitive side to George. And even at that early age, he was very much, into his guitar work, right? He wanted to be the best guitarist in Liverpool, and he practiced. And it was great because we used to see him working away. His fingers would be bloody, blistered and all the other bits and pieces. But he'd keep working, keep, practicing till he got those licks off. And, anyone listens to his music now realizes all that practice brought perfection, right? Paul was very much a case of, as Paul is today, he's the king of the PR, isn't he? Right? Public relations, if there isn't a man, he's got the media wrapped up. But even at those early days, they were all great musicians, all in their own right, great vocalists. Paul had a vocal range that was absolutely incredible, right? He could sing ballads from, Peggy Lee through to wailing and screaming like Little Richard. And it was wonderful to, see that vocal range. Musical ability went without, multi-talented. He could play the trumpet. Sometimes. When we let him. He could play the piano. He was a versatile guitarist. He could play bass. But even from an early day, and we realised that, he was very much PR orientated. When we were in Hamburg, and we were jamming about, and we were laughing and joking, and up to all the prantics and the antics that we did in Hamburg, Paul was the one religiously making sure that everyone in Liverpool knew what the Beatles were up to. And we have to thank him for that, But I think he's just progressed. Now he's the phenomenon which the world knows today. And he's still, I laugh inside, he's still the king of the PR as far as I'm concerned.
Well, our impression of Pete Best is very good, especially after this weekend. And it's been a real thrill to have you as part of our family here in Chicago. So thank you, Pete.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pete Best.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, in case you're wondering what's in the box, remember we turned around and said that we were going to be doing a draw, and the winners of it, courtesy of myself and Icelandair, would have 2 free return tickets to anywhere